to get into Paul Page, so that's why we're here. I'd like to talk a little bit about Paul. You can kind of see up there, but many of you know Paul from the Indy 500, so hopefully you guys enjoyed us being able to play some of the Indy 500 calls over the loudspeakers. I know it brought sometimes little goosebumps to myself as I heard those. I don't know about you guys, but Paul, as you can see with his bio here, he's loved racing since he was a teenager, and he's been really a multifaceted individual in the sense of being a reporter, both on radio and also on TV. So you saw him on ABC, NBC. Not only was he with the Indy 500, but he did all the other kart events. He was also, maybe you saw him in some of the NASCAR events, NHRA, Olympics, sumo wrestling. So get into some of that, but he did a lot, let's say. And along with that, being on NBC, ABC, ESPN, but he won 2 Emmys. And he also was just recently inducted into the Hall of Fame there at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. So, that's great. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And then Ken Gross was so kind. You guys probably know Ken. He's our guest curator. He's family to us. He was kind enough to come back. He's going to kind of be a moderator for this to help us. We're going to do it a little differently, where instead of doing just strictly talking from Paul, we're going to try and leave up a lot of time for you guys to ask questions to Paul. So we'll have 2 microphones here after we get done with a little bit of the discussion. Myself and Tom will carry out the microphone so you guys can ask the questions. But again, I'd like to mention for Ken, for those who don't know, he's been a 31-year Pebble Beach Concours d'Alliance chief class judge. He's written 24 books, coming on 25 books here soon. And not only that, but he's the recipient of the Automotive Hall of Fame Distinguished Service Citation, the International Motor Press Association's Ken W. Purdy Award, and the Motor Press Guild's Dean Bachelor Award, and the Lee Iacocca Award. So a lot of awards. So again, thanks, Ken, for being here. Now I'll be quiet and let those guys go ahead and get into it. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. And I hope my voice is loud enough. Sometimes I tend to be sort of soft-spoken. It's a thrill for me to be sitting here with Paul. I've listened to Paul, it feels like my whole life. And my brother and I are dyed-in-the-wool Indy 500 fans. We listen to the 500 each year, and even though we no longer watch it together, we compare notes, and it's something we've done since the Sid Collins days. And we'll hear a little bit about Sid as we talk. What I wanted to do is show you a few photographs from Paul's book, and we'll talk a little bit about what's in the photos, and then we'll get into some general questions, and then we'd really like to hear from you. So we'll start by, as Bruce said, Paul's been a car enthusiast and fascinated with the Indy 500 from a very early age. He wanted to be a broadcaster from the beginning, and what I find interesting is, and he'll tell you a little bit about this, as a kid he wrote to his favorite driver, Eddie Sachs, who sometimes was called the Clown Prince of Racing, but was a serious driver. And Paul, tell us a little bit about that. It kind of is your first start.
I went to my first Indy 500 in 1960. And that was a time when Eddie was a pole sitter, and he was bigger than life. Like you say, the Clown Prince of Racing, always funny, always had a line going. And so he became my hero, he and Jim Hurtubise. And I wrote to Eddie Sachs, and I said, I would like to do something with the 500, perhaps in journalism. Okay. He wrote me back. I couldn't believe that this guy wrote me back on letterhead, no email in those days and everything, and encouraged me to follow my dream, which is pretty much what I've done.
We're going to skip to the next slide. We'll come back to the helicopter crash because we go. So this is kind of where I thought we'd be starting, as Paul kind of is the standard Midwestern fare, Cub Scout basic training in the Army. Let's go to the next slide, Bruce. And over the years, Paul did some amateur racing himself. Won the race in 1978 at the Speedrome that you can see there, and over the years got to meet almost all the drivers. We're going to switch through these slides quickly, and we'll get to our so Blake, let's go to the next one. Here's Paul in 1964 at WAIV with, oh gosh, I'm blanking, Paul, but the jazz music.
George Sherman.
George, right.
George Shearing, sorry.
George Shearing.
And George Shearing, the
Right.
blind pianist.
Yep. And remember some of these faces because we're going to be talking about how Paul started as a pit reporter at Indy. That's the famous Sid Collins in 1976, who was the previous voice of the 500. And the next photo over here shows Paul beginning in 1977 when he did his first, when he did it for the first time. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's hold this, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of this. So, not easy to break into something like a major event like the Indy 500. What were some of the things that you had to do to impress Sid Collins so that he'd give you a shot?
Well, at first I didn't impress him very much at all. I worked at WIBC, where he was a sports director and where he ran the radio network out of. And I had gone to do an interview at a soapbox derby, and I interviewed the winner. And I really wanted to impress Sid in any way I could, of course. And when I got back to the station, he was standing in the hallway, arms crossed, and the meanest look. And he said, "That was terrible." Okay, I'm done with all this now, I see. But then he took me back in one of the studios and started teaching me the art of the interview, and then one thing led to another, and we became close friends, and he was my mentor. But every time he'd give me a lesson, he'd say, but there's no place for you at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Radio Network. And then, okay. But eventually he came around, found a place for me, and it worked out.
So in those early days, before television started covering the Indy 500, there was a radio broadcast that went around the world that Sid organized. I know I listened to it as a kid. Maybe there are a number of you out there with gray hair who did the same thing. What I found fascinating, and what Paul can tell us how they did it, was radio. If you think of radio as the theater of the mind, think of it as your imagination is working with what you're hearing to create a picture, because there's no picture. And what they did was extraordinary. They'd have a guy, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but in each corner of the speedway, and they would bring it to life. So you're sitting there listening, and you could see it in your mind. You could see the colors of the cars. You knew who the drivers were. You knew what they were doing. Paul, tell us how you did that. I mean, it was pretty extraordinary.
Well, the first thing you do is you find people with passion for the racing. And we had some guys that were overwhelmingly passionate. And when Sid created the network, you couldn't have done it. 1952 was when he started it. You really couldn't have done it back in those days. There were no satellites, and it was pretty antiquated audio lines and stuff like that. So every corner had to have an engineer with it and everything. So Sid solved that problem by involving all the radio stations in Indianapolis. And so the announcers came from them, and the engineers. It was a big engineering staff, and of course you had AT&T long lines. So we had 1,300 stations back. Well, when I was there, but to get them on the air, you have to call long lines and say, okay, we got this station. Okay, we got that one, and it just kept growing. So.
Well, and this was not a dress rehearsal. The race was the real thing going on. And they had no idea what would happen in the race. I mean, there were brilliant passes, there were fabulous pit stops, and sadly there were crashes. One of the ones I'm thinking of, sadly, was Eddie Sachs. Mm-hmm. And the brilliance of Sid was that he put together what has become one of the greatest racing eulogies forever, and maybe you could tell us a little about
Yeah,
how
it
that
was
came
a
about.
terrible accident on the main straightaway, huge fire, took the life of both Eddie Sachs and Dave McDonald, and the radio network had to keep going, so they were, you're making up anything, and trying to shift the audience away from that concern because nothing had actually been officially announced, though in the booth, they knew what was going on and what happened. And so it was about a 2-hour delay, and Sid, during that time, thought about what he might say. And he had a little envelope. On the outside was written fatalities, but it was some poems, some lyric, to remind him of things to say. So they waited until the PA system announced Eddie's passing, and the radio network turned the microphones on for the PA so you could hear it, and then as soon as it was done, then Sid started into this eulogy, which used a little bit of Byron, and but we call it, at the radio network, the Death Has 1,000 Doors eulogy, and it ripped your heart out. And even today, it will pull at you. It's really a marvelous piece of work.
Along with many other anecdotes, it's in Paul's book, which I have now read twice, and I commend it to you all because it's just filled with fabulous stories. Sid apparently at one point said to Paul, "You've got the technique down," I'm paraphrasing a little bit, "but I want the passion." So how do you get the passion? How did that happen?
Well, I had the passion, I just had to show it to him. And that's what he wanted, and what I wanted in all of our announcers. Repertorial skills are one thing, but you have to love this thing, or you're not going to be any good at it. And so I think through a number of different ways, and being dedicated to being a field reporter from the radio station, not part of the network, but covering it. And he finally said, "Oh, all right, you got the passion, but still no job."
We'll get to how that job came about in a moment, but part of, I guess, being able to prepare for something like this was you going into garages, standing along pit lane, getting to know drivers, getting to know crew chiefs, the major players in that day. And did they accept you in the beginning, or were you like a new kid on the block?
I think at that time they were, especially A.J. Foyt, was very wary of any announcer or any reporter that came to their garages, because that was the old breed in I actually started in 74. And they didn't care about media. They didn't know anything about media. They were race drivers, and so you could pester them. Well, I think they sensed how much I was involved. At that time, I was actually getting off my radio station work and going right to George Bignotti's garage, and I was a parts washer, and they let me keep my Formula Ford there, so that was good. And and through that, many of the crews got to know me and realized that I had an interest. I was a gearhead, and so they started opening up.
Well, and part of what you did was race yourself. Learn how to race, buy a race car, learn how to work on it and set it up and so forth. That must have given you some credibility with these guys.
Yeah, I created the axiom that the brakes are ineffective when the car is upside down, and proved it on more than one occasion. Yeah, except these were rough and tough sprint car guys. And I'm driving a little Formula Ford in the SCCA, and sometimes they were uncomplimentary about that little car, They had some lines, some of them I can't even share with you, but they were funny, but they were tough on me.
Well, and part of that was they were driving cars like this, and this is an A.J. Watson Roadster. It's got a big
Isn't she beautiful?
honking, Offie engine. These were the cars until the very early 60s, and it took a pretty strong person to drive one. There's no power steering here, and you've got big heavy tires, and a car that just needs to be, pardon the expression, manhandled in order to run. So I guess they weren't taking somebody driving a little British Tiddler too seriously in that.
Well, Rick Mears got to drive one of these once. And he said something that none of the other drivers ever said, and maybe they didn't know it, but he recognized these are heavy wheels and tires. He recognized that they had a gyroscopic effect. And that was the reason that the wheel was so big, was they needed that leverage to just turn the wheels a little bit offline. And I mean, look at that. That's a beauty. And there's no fiberglass or anything there. That's all carefully tapped out aluminum. And I love just looking at the tail behind the fuel tank and how it comes around the push bar in the back. These are A.J. Watson's work. And boy, I think these are the most beautiful race cars I've ever seen.
Well, A.J. Watson, who had a shop in Indianapolis, he restored this car about 9 years ago. George Lyons, a collector who owns several of these, was kind enough to loan it to us, and A.J., as one of his last projects, worked on it. So the car was built by Watson and restored by Watson, and it's got an AACA badge on the dash to prove that it's a pretty great restoration.
There's a couple of people that build replica of these, and so I approached AJ once and I said, you know, we got all these replicas. How do I tell your car from the replica? And he said, go look at the welds. Okay. He said, I am the worst welder in the world, so if it has ugly welds, that's my car.
So there are two AJs when you think about Indianapolis, and of course the other is AJ Foyt, who was a four-time winner and who was able, unlike a lot of drivers, he made the transition from driving the front-engine cars to the rear-engine. But you had a kind of special relationship with AJ. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, after a while I think he began to trust me, though he didn't like most reporters anyway, and it was not uncommon for a wrench to come flying out of the garage at one of us. So, and he was particularly caught up with a reporter, a writer at the time who just passed away named Robin Miller. And every time Robin would get near his garage, here would come the wrenches. And fortunately, I think he tolerated me more than anything else. But it was, you know,
but you were his,
first four-time winner. This is a god standing here.
Right. Well, you were his house guest. He had to like you, I think. That's pretty cool. So we've got some driver photos up here. We'll talk about a few more of them, but go back if you would, please, Blake. Yeah. So in the center we've got Jim Hurtubise.
Notice I had hair. Please.
Well, I wanted to talk about Hurtubise and then Mickey and then Danny. And Jim Hurtubise was kind of the archetype Indy driver, I think it's fair to say. He could drive one of these as well as perhaps anybody, but he'd had an accident which left him with a decision where most people would never have made. And tell us a little bit about that. Yeah, about how he was able to get his hands in shape to drive. That's I think
he asked him, please make my hands into claws so that I can grab the steering wheel. And the first year I went, he didn't qualify until the second day, and at that time, the 150 mile an hour barrier was huge. That's 1 minute around the track. And they were close to it. The front row, the pole sitters, they were close. And then he comes along, virtual unknown on the second day, and he runs 149.056 miles an hour. He didn't get the 150. It didn't happen that year, but suddenly he's huge in all of our eyes. And he's a super driver, and he was a funny guy. In later years, when he was still trying to run front engine cars for the longest time, and he had a car in the qualifying line, and toward the end of the day, on the fourth day, towards 6 o'clock when the gun fires, and he kept taking it out of the line and putting it back, and taking it out of the line and putting it back. And nobody could, what's Hurtubise up to? What's the Herc doing? And as soon as the gun went off, he opened the engine compartment and was full of beer, chilled down beer.
So he never intended to qualify that.
No, not at all.
No, that would have been, no. Another photo up there is Mickey Thompson, who some of you might remember held a land speed record at Bonneville with a streamliner that had 4 supercharged Pontiac engines.
Right.
He went over 400 miles an hour, and he was a very innovative guy. His race car in 1964 was unlike anything the Speedway had ever seen, probably contributed to the crash, do you think?
Well, yes and no. You're talking the 64 crash.
Yes, yeah. A little wheel car.
Yeah, they had smaller wheels and tires on the car, and they also had some, they weren't intended to be airfoils, but there were some halfway covering on the wheels. And the theory was that those cars were so light, especially in the draft of the entire field sucking them along, that they just lifted up off on the ground, and Dave McDonald's just slowly spun around, and he hit the wall, and there was a burst of fire, and then Eddie came down, and actually, it burst his fuel tank, and I mean, that was a huge, I was sitting in the first turn as a kid, and that was a huge, huge explosion. But you look at this picture, this is pretty typical of Mickey. If you look carefully, that's actually a four-wheel drive Indy car. You can see the shaft in the front. And he'd come to the track with that kind of innovation. And unfortunately, the spec cars that we race now, you don't get that innovation, as you well know.
Right.
But man was a genius, and always had that crew cut. But talk to him, I could sit there and talk for hours with that guy. And he tolerated me, so it was good.
Well, innovation was something we saw a lot more of, I think, in the 50s and 60s. And today, as you say, they're spec cars, meaning they're done pretty much to a formula. But your son is involved with these new cars.
Well, and you saw the Sid Collins picture. That was my son in his arms. My son's now 44, and he's an aerospace engineer that works for Andretti Autosports. And so he is sometimes frustrated by the fact that they are spec cars, and he can't do much. I mean, he's doing things in terms of a thousandth of an inch, and sometimes hoping the officials don't look real close. Now, this wasn't him, but the team got caught a week ago when they weighed the car after the race. They had the water bottle in the car with water in it, and that brought the car up to weight. So the officials went in and took that out, and now he's underweight. Now he's paying $25,000 and losing 20 points. And that's, we talked about this, that's an example. They would call it cheating, but it's really expanding the envelope, trying to get it past somebody, and it's very, very common.
Yeah, cheating has a bad connotation, particularly with country western songs. But as Paul said, the reality is, and I wanted to talk about Roger Penske in this regard. There are people, many of these people, who they study the rule book and they study the car and they look for ways that somebody hasn't thought of. And right. Penske, I guess, you mentioned some really great examples.
Yeah, he when he was running Can-Am car, you're up at Road America, one of the most beautiful courses in the United States, and really ought to be a Formula One course, but they don't have the barrier system. Anyhow, he came to the track with the fuel tank for the pits on a 30-foot scaffolding. And the reason he did that was the height created more head pressure. You could refuel the car faster. Well, of course, they had to allow it. There was no rule against it. The next day there was a rule against it, but that's pretty common. I mean, again, Roger took advantage of a rule that was kind of obscure about racing stock block engines, which was not really something that was successful for the people who had tried it. But Roger, using the rule, built an engine, which of course was totally unexpected, tested it in total secrecy. In fact, one of the tests for the cars, they did it in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, and there was snowbanks on either side of the track. They had to, and Paul Tracy drove that one, but they did everything they could to keep it secret, and they did, and they showed up at the track, and here's this, it actually was badged Mercedes, Ilmore engine, and during the month, they actually would get out of the throttle on the backstretch just so people wouldn't know how powerful it was. It was a monster. There's a book out called The Beast, and that's the story of that.
And they won.
Oh, yeah, they won. Big time.
And the following year, there was a rule against...
Yeah, can't have those anymore. Same thing with the turbines.
So the ultimate, I don't want to say cheater, let's say the ultimate manipulator might have been Smokey Yunick, and you knew Smokey.
Well,
you can tell us a little
first of all, you know that from NASCAR.
Yes.
I had the good opportunity of meeting him with Bobby Unser. We'd go for the Daytona race. We'd go early in the week, and we'd do an IROC race in the middle of the week. And then we'd go over to Smokey Yunick's best damn garage in town. Now, the primary purpose of this trip was to pick up a case of moonshine that Johnny Rutherford wanted, and I snuck a bottle out of it. But then we'd sit sipping into the late hours, and he'd talk about things he had done. And my absolute favorite is NASCAR at Daytona going through tech, and they were convinced that he was doing something to extend the fuel. And so they started taking the car apart, and it was like 2.5 hours into the inspection. They got the fuel tank sitting out behind the car, parts all over the place, and finally Smokey got tired of it. And he said, all right, that's it, I'm done with it. He got in the car and drove it back to his garage. The fuel tank's still sitting here. So figure that out. And at Indy, he actually created a car. Indy is a lot about weight and balance, 4 left turns, so you balance it that way. And he did it by building 2 little capsules, one for the driver and one for the engine. Weird looking, and wasn't unfortunately very successful, but that was the innovation out of this era. That was just, it was incredible.
There's a 3-volume book on Smokey Yunick. Doesn't have all of his secrets in it, but it's pretty exciting.
Well, I can give you a couple of them. In a cup car, before qualifying, he would jack the car up, and then he'd take a CO2 fire extinguisher and spray the shocks, and car would go out and qualify. Well, the shocks allowed it eventually. He actually had an illegal ride height that they didn't know it going out, and so they'd be fast. And finally, NASCAR caught on to the whole thing, and that's why they actually do the check underneath the car when they come in. He was a pretty amazing man.
One of my favorites, just to add one to that, is he made I think it was a Camaro that people called like a 7/8 car. He'd streamlined it so much that you couldn't tell with the naked eye too much looking at it, but they knew there was something fishy. It just looked too slippery. Mm-hmm. And the NASCAR people developed these templates. Your car had to fit with the templates tight to the sheet metal or the fiberglass, or it wasn't legal. Well, Smokey's car could bomb under there with inches to spare. So that's what.
When that was, people didn't know about it. Richard Petty had one, and there was a vice president from Plymouth who came down. He had his personal car was painted exactly like Richard Petty's, including the number and everything. And he drove it in the garage area because he was a big wheel, and right up to the garage and parked it next to the race car. Crew went nuts. Get that out of here. And because the 2 of them side by side, you suddenly realized one of them was a miniature, so they had to get them the hell out of there.
But we've got a photo up there with, if you're looking, you're seeing Paul with Danny Sullivan. And
you look good, don't you think?
You notice they have blazers on and shorts. Paul, I think there's probably an interesting reason, right?
This is in Rio, and it was 104 degrees there for an IndyCar race. And so we asked the producer, you're only shooting from the waist up, so can we put shorts on? Sure, fine. And so we started the on-camera, and this is live, so you can't redo any of it. And we're doing the on-camera, and I look up at the camera, and I see the elements in the lens start to move, and I realize the director is pulling a wide shot on us, and ended up with this somewhat embarrassing. There's 2 big deal, big-time network announcers looking like idiots. Well, we did that a lot, actually.
Danny will forever be remembered, and he was a great driver, but for Spin and Win.
Yep.
Were you there for that?
I was.
Would you tell us about it?
Well, it was 1985, and he was chasing Mario Andretti, and he came into the short chute between 1 and 2, south end of the speedway, and he tried to pass Andretti. He totally lost it, just totally spinning around down there. He caught the car, which pretty amazing. Up to that time, only Jimmy Clark had actually done a spin and caught it, and continued on. They brought the yellow out, and so he pitted on his own yellow, got new tires on, went back out, finally passed Andretti, and won the race. So.
And you had a friendship with Mario Andretti as well, I think.
Yeah. He actually, in my book, which I apologize is out of print, but we're gonna try to cure that here shortly. He wrote the introduction, and the first line is, "Paul Page is not a rat." And the producer goes, "We can't use that. That's embarrassing to you." I said, "No." His point was that as a reporter, I would keep the secrets. And so they'd share them with me. And this was really important for my job because they'd come along and they say, look, we're trying this or that on the car, and we got this plan. Well, I couldn't know about it then, but I had that information, so when the car won, now that was released, and I could tell you. And so, but Mario and I, there's some pictures of the two of us that ought not probably be published. And we did a couple go-kart races and cheated at all of them. We were a team, and we used the same go-kart, and we're the ones who figured out how to reach back and grab the governor and negate its effect. And Mario he's to this day, he's the best ambassador the sport has. And, Formula One champion, IndyCar champion, Indy 500 winner, and yet he's a pretty humble guy. He's really a great human being.
We've talked about all these guys, but there were women at Indy, and in your book you talk about Janet Guthrie, who came up through the sports car ranks and probably was the first serious woman driver to do well there. And
yeah, before her, Arlene Hiss tried it at Phoenix. She was Mike Hiss, the race driver's wife, and they wouldn't let her on the track after the first practice. But here comes Janet, who is a skillful sports car driver, and part of the racing community is going nuts. We can't have a woman, da-da-da-da-da-da. But Bobby Unser loaned her a driver's suit to do some of her testing. Everybody, including A.J. Foyt, would come up and give her tips, and she was the nicest lady. And we got to be pretty good friends. That was my first year as the anchor. And so after qualifying one day, she said, at the end of the day, come over to the house, in the apartment. Teams getting together there. So I got over there, and I walked in the door, and the whole crew's there, and the first thing they do is get up, they grab my tie and cut it in half.
I think it was a special
painted
tie.
silk tie. And Janet was all over herself trying to apologize, but it also kind of shows for the comradeship that you get out of the racers.
Well, didn't AJ loan her a car when she couldn't qualify, just to see how well she could do, and she did really well.
She lives in Aspen now, and when I was doing the X Games, I would see her in the Winter X Games.
I believe she was an MIT engineer.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, she was
at all the qualifications and a real pioneer to break in. And talking about, we talked earlier about Danica, who is no stranger to everyone, and kind of your thoughts on her as a driver.
Well, she made a huge mistake qualifying at Indy. And the mistake was she went out, and this was when you now could have multiple qualifications, and the run was terrible. So they were going to pull the run and send her back out again. But the PA announcers start talking to her, and she starts throwing the team under the bus. This is terrible. I'm embarrassed of this crew and everything. And the crowd just went nuts. Boo, boo, boo. And she never really lived that down. But I watched her race at Homestead in Florida, and I watched her go side by side with Tony Kanaan for about 18 laps. So she was a capable race driver. She just needed not to be quite so haughty. She won when she raced for Andretti Autosports, again where my son works, and he met her in the hall. She shook his hand, hi, how are you? And then went through the whole shop, introducing herself, and gets up to the engineering department and walks through and is introducing herself to them, and she sees my son, and it was like, I've already met you, and moved on. Didn't help the relationship in the engineering department very much.
So we're going, in a moment or two, we're going to let you ask questions, but at lunch I mentioned something to Paul I wasn't sure I could ask, and he was very gracious about it, and it's something I've always wondered as a race fan, and that's the whole idea that racing is dangerous, and people sadly have crashes, and people die. I said to Paul at lunch, would you talk just a little about that? How you felt about it as an observer? Many of these people were your friends. How do you cope with what can be the occasional tragedy in racing?
Well, first, those of us who did the whole series, we're members of the racing community. We're all traveling together, same hotels together and everything, so we're all very, very close. And probably the most tragic fatality I had to handle was when Greg Moore, who was an up-and-coming driver, he was going to go racing for Penske in the ensuing year. He had a golden future ahead of him, and he got killed during the race. And I knew it was a fatality immediately, and I told our broadcast truck by our backline communication is, don't replay any of that. And so I had to figure out throughout the race what I was going to say. And in that case, we couldn't do anything, even though we knew what the outcome was, until Ben Cart announced it. And I hope I did right by him. But and I did a drag racer, Coletta. And those are just horrible because they're part of your family. Mm-hmm. And you sit there and you think about it. And unlike Sid, I didn't have something to remember. I always try to prepare myself more by not memorizing, but going through all my notes before the start of a race, because once you get going on a race, you can't look down at a note. And I just hope I did well by the few I had to do. And, but it's also what it is. And more often than not, I think you all know, you'll hear a driver say, well, that would be the way I'd want to go. If I'm going to die, I want to do it in a race car. And that was kind of a universal opinion. So,
what can we answer from all of you? Any questions out there?
Yeah, come on, this is the fun part. Question.
Because we can't see your hands, so someone will have to answer.
We got one right here.
Great.
You were going to mention about the helicopter crash?
Yes.
What helicopter crash?
Blake, let's go back to the helicopter crash picture. This is certainly one of the more dramatic elements of the life of Paul Page.
Yeah, I was doing news and traffic in the helicopter for WIBC. And one day we were flying actually across the north end of the speedway. We heard this really loud crack. And I looked at the pilot, he looked at me. Everything's okay, we continued on, and we heard it again. And that's when the main rotor stopped in flight, because the pinion gear at the base of the main rotor shaft had destroyed itself and stopped the rotor. So now there's no auto rotation, and we took on the aerodynamics of a homesick brick, and this is the result of our work. I ended up laying right, almost, it's actually gasoline that's under the tail boom of the helicopter because it came out of the two fuel tanks. But our luck was, at first I thought we were going to hit Speedway High School. But they had enough energy that it carried us over to their athletic field, which was incredibly fortunate for us. It was December day, December 1st. The ground was kind of soft from rain. Not that that mattered, I don't think. But I retired at about 50 feet. Didn't work. But, yeah, that was the moment that taught me, and the race drivers follow this. It's going to get... Death could reach out at any second and grab you. So you have to live a full life. You have to do everything you hope and think you can do. And so I always tell people that was the biggest touchdown that Speedway High School ever had. So.
The obvious follow-up to that would be to ask Paul if he ever got in a helicopter again.
Okay, yes, because I love aviation, and I have good relations with NASA, and would go hang out at Johnson Space Center and fly their sim of the shuttle. And then with the Navy, there was a year that I was on like 8 different carriers and trapping onto the carrier. And I was really lucky. And that never bothered me, actually, never bothered me. It changed attitude. But
I think you could probably say the same for a lot of race drivers. They've had crashes,
yeah.
and they're drivers, so yeah. They get back in the car, and or you get back on the horse. Who else is out there with a question?
Sure.
Sir. You've probably been asked this 1,000 Well, wait for the mic.
For the mic so everybody can...
Please, thanks.
So I imagine you've been asked this 1,000 times, but what would be your favorite Indy 500 ever, or favorite Indy 500 moment ever?
My favorite moment was when Rick Mears and Gordon Johncock were racing to the finish in what was then the closest finish ever. And I had noticed on my stopwatch, because we didn't have computers or anything then, I was keeping track of the interval, and I suddenly realized they're closing at a rate that they will be side by side on the white flag. So I got on the off-air to all of the announcers. I said, we're going to play this. We got to look at that interval. We'll keep talking about that interval. And so it worked out. I was right. And on the last lap, they were side by side, and the crowd was nuts, to the point I could tell where the cars were on the track in our broadcast booth, which is right over the starting line at the time. I could tell where they at by the cheers of the crowd. I mean, it was like a quadraphonic experience. And, then nobody had ever seen a race nearly that close. And the only downside of it is when I got to ABC and went to work for them, and they started building up how good they were at Indy. In that particular case, they decided it was a good idea on that last lap to put a picture of Rick Mears' wife, Dina, at that time. And they did it when they were going into turn one and held it for maybe 5 seconds. Well, that's where everything happened. So I said, I need to help you with some of these things. But they turned out to be, I enjoyed working for ABC. I think
Radio would have been very different in those circumstances.
Oh, radio is you said it, theater of the mind.
Still your favorite way.
Hopefully you can't, television, you're limited by what that monitor is. And if it's not on the monitor, it doesn't happen for the viewer. And that would be a thing that would drive me crazy. One year, right after the start, car hit the end of the pit wall and shattered, broke in half, slid down the pits and everything. I could see it out of the booth, but it's not on the set. I'm thinking, it seemed like 10 minutes. It turned out to be like a second and a half. They finally got the shot, but television doesn't have the individuality that you can do in radio, and in radio I can do simultaneous occurrences and make them where television can't. And I love television, but I much more prefer doing radio, and I still do. I'm the old guy in the back of the booth on race day and for the 500. May
I just interrupt with one quick point from your book that I loved apropos of all this. Wilbur Shaw saying he didn't think that a broadcast would work.
Yeah.
That people wouldn't listen to the entire race on the radio, and how could it possibly be done? And then I think maybe it was you, but someone also commented when ESPN came out, 24 hours a day of sports, who'd watch that?
Yeah.
Anyway, sir, up there.
While you're getting the mic, I'll tell you a quick story. Bob Jenkins was my successor on the radio at the Indy 500, and then joined us in television. And ESPN was not even on the air yet, and they were going to do a race to Eldora. And they called me, and they said, we know you can't announce because you're exclusive with NBC, but can you produce it? Yeah, sure. So I went to Bob Jenkins, who was a close buddy, and I said, come on, you'll be the announcer on this. And got another guy, Larry Newber, who we really loved. And Jenkins comes to me after I get all the commitment done, and he says, what is this? What is ESPN? And here's my answer. Bob, it's a 24-hour sports station. It's never going to last. Just take the money. Yeah, I wasn't really bright at that kind of stuff then.
I think I saw a hand up there. Yes. Yeah.
Talking about your radio experiences, here it is 50 years later, after what you described with announcers in all four corners. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, it's WRN, the radio network for NASCAR.
Yeah, MRN, sure.
MRN.
I've been on MRN.
It is doing that right now, is the same thing
Yeah.
some 50 years later.
Yeah.
So
Well,
applaud your...
it was the right formula.
Yeah.
It's, and I've done a couple races with them. They were kind enough to invite me to do it, and they do a stellar job. They really do. But now we have all the technology. We have the wireless mics, and we don't have to run wires to each corner anymore. It's all wireless, and it's pretty easy. It's like maybe 2 big cases to bring, because I did do, after I did the Indy 500, both radio and then television, they asked me to come back to do the radio again. And the technology difference from then to the second time I came back, it's pretty amazing what they can do now. And MRN are masters at it.
The other issue I just wanted to ask you about is that...
An issue?
Well, not issue, but the other point that I wanted to just ask you about is the fact that you're such a stalwart in the industry. Did you come across and chat with Chris Economaki much and have much experiences with him?
Well, he was the same off the air as he was on. That was, a little bit pompous, but his daughter was a producer at NBC, and she and I worked together for a lot of things, and people would hear her name, and it's like, oh, you're that person, you're the daughter of that guy. Chris was, he was a good man. I mean, I thought he brought a lot to the, especially boxing, to the stuff he covered. He was clever, and now we don't have storytellers anymore in television. They're pretty much, and they're trained into it now. I considered myself a storyteller. I needed to know the background of these people and make them human to you, not just the drivers, pit crew and everything. So that was the way I saw it, and it certainly was the same way that he saw it, because he would tell stories, some of them outrageous, but you loved him for it, and then you'd hate him for the next thing he'd say. So, but he was a nice man, actually, very nice man.
Yes, back to the written word. You mentioned in a hint that you might be re-releasing your book. Where can we find your book now?
Now I think you can still get a copy at Barnes & Noble online, but don't hold me to that.
Autobooks, Aero Books in Burbank,
In
California.
Burbank, yeah.
If you go on their website, Autobooks, Aero,
Autobooks,
AERO
Aerobooks.
Books.
Yeah,
Yep.
those are all signed too. That's a great little store.
Yes.
You can get the I forget what they call it, but you can get the electronic version of the book on Amazon. Actually, Autobooks, Aerobooks called me the other day, and I said, we got a demand here, and there are no books. So she was one, Tina there, who actually talked me in to thinking about doing the next book. So that's by the way, not a high profit area in one's life. If we made $1,000 on it overall, it was a labor of love. I wanted to take the last great history, in my view, that was written of the Indy 500 was written by Al Blemker, who was a Speedway publicist, and that one ended in 1959. So when I conceived of my book, I used the history of the 500 from 1960, my first race to view, onward. And so that was the frame we hung the tail on. So a little bit of history and then an anecdote, and it was fun to write. So and I'm thinking about another one, but maybe only my mom and my family would buy it.
Anyone
Sir.
else out there? Yeah, good.
Can you comment on Sarah Fisher?
Yeah. Sarah was a good driver. What she didn't have, and I'm not trying to be critical, it just happened to be a fact. In fact, her car owner, Derek Walker at the time, when I would be talking to him about her, he said, she's so good, but she doesn't have the fire. She's not the tiger who will make the pass. But she was good, and then she became a team owner, and now has, in Speedway on Main Street, has a go-kart track and fun stuff, and she's there all the time. And she drove pace cars for a long time. She just, I like Sarah. I liked her a lot. She was pretty humble, actually. Sir?
Mr. Page, welcome to Cartersville. I have two questions. If you would care to comment on CART versus IRL, and secondly, your thoughts about the Savoy Museum, and you don't know anything about it, and now all of a sudden you get invited to come to our museum, and you had a preconceived notion before you got here, and now you're here. I'd be interested in your thoughts pre and post visit to Cartersville.
This is the finest auto racing oriented or automotive racing, automotive related museum I've ever seen. And I'm not saying that because we're sitting here. This place just knocked me over when I walked in. And the attention to the detail and the way they've done things, and of course, Ken was the middle of all that, but if there is a museum that is even close, it might be the Mercedes Museum in Stuttgart. But they also have, all those famous silver arrow Mercedes. This place is to die for. It's really good. What was the first question?
CART versus IRL.
Was there such a thing?
I don't care to comment.
No, I'll comment. It was actually a great idea. It was, I don't know how many of you know about it. It was a series that Tony George, then the owner of the Speedway, created because he didn't like what CART was doing with racing in general. And he was afraid that they were trying to take over the Speedway, but he also had some marvelous ideas. He wanted to return the cars to engines and everything where they worked on them. The engines today, the mechanics they're not allowed to touch them. Your engineer from Honda or Chevrolet will come install that engine and leave. Well, he wanted it to go back to this day. And so he created the Indy Racing League. And while it had a lot of good ideas, it split the sport. And it split the sport when NASCAR, when its star was rising. And so IndyCar lost a lot of fans to NASCAR just because of that. People just got tired of the fighting back and forth. I think Tony George was good-hearted in his intent, but I also think he got a lot of bad advice. He's surrounded by some lieutenants who they were all going for turf sovereignty. They going to have their thing, and so it didn't work out. But the concept was cool, but the reality of it just wouldn't work. That answer that? Okay, good. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was murdered in his own driveway. In fact, his wife would call me constantly asking me to put information on the air because at that time they didn't know who the killer was. And so I would do that for her. And then finally they identified the guy, and it took a while to actually build a case against him and convict him, but they finally did that. But I don't really understand what his motive was. He was nuts. He was apparently jealous of Mickey in some way.
They'd had a deal go bad.
I'm sorry?
They'd had a deal go bad in that stadium
right.
racing thing.
Yeah, but so...
And it was an execution by two guys who rode away on bicycles, and
it
was Colleen, Mickey's sister.
Colleen, right.
She wanted to, they knew who it was, and she was relentless to get this guy, and ultimately they did. They put him in jail.
Yeah, but boy, we lost something then. That mind was remarkable.
While they're thinking of maybe one more question. Oh, he's got one right here. Good.
Wait for the mic so everybody can hear you.
Bruce is bringing the microphone. Oh, we've got a microphone. Good.
Actually, before my question, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the fact that this very car, according to the placard, was the last traditional roadster to ever qualify for the 500 in 1966, where unfortunately it was caught up in the infamous start line crash that eliminated about a third of the field. Mm-hmm. So I think its racing day was about 200 yards.
Yeah. And you know that's right? Yeah. The thing about this car, besides its beauty, this is the oil tank right here, and that's what one of these bolts here broke on Parnelli Jones's car when he was on his way to winning the 500. And his owner, J.C. Agajanian, and the chief steward of the race, J.C. ran down to the start line because they were going to black flag this car, or that car, and bring it in. And he actually convinced the chief steward that it had leaked down below the bolt, so everything was fine, which doesn't account for the centrifugal force that you're going on there. But
robbing Jimmy Clark of a win.
I'm sorry?
Robbing Jimmy Clark of a win that year.
Yeah. The fuel was, this is a huge fuel tank, which caused some of the real problems that day. It's not a self-sealing fuel tank or anything, it's just a fuel tank. And I never quite understood why then they put the exhaust pipe right next to where they were refueling. And what they would do, though, I finally caught on, is they had like an asbestos sleeve So the refueler would come up, throw that sleeve on there, and then refuel that car. And at this time, some of the refueling was actually gravity, was pressurized feed. So if anything went wrong and that started spraying out, you had yourself a pretty serious problem.
Yeah, which happened to Parnelli in '64, if I recall. My question was going to be, we all know of Chip Ganassi's success as a team owner, but of course he was a driver before, and
I
I'm
raced
just
them in
wondering,
Formula Fords.
I'm just wondering your response about, what Ganassi was like as a driver.
Wasn't very good. I didn't. That doesn't leave this room. But he was a super owner, and he's created a marvelous team. Of course, this year he's a couple weeks ago got into a quandary because one of his key drivers, the reigning champion Alex Palou, announced that he had signed with McLaren, which was great news to Ganassi because he had like a multiple-year deal with Ganassi. And so now there are lawsuits flying back and forth everywhere. Fortunately, the team is getting along pretty good, but I'm wondering how it is when the drivers go back in the engineering trailer, and they say it's fine. I need to go in the engineering trailer myself and see how it is. But he's fielded some incredible cars over his time.
I thought someone might ask what you think the future of the Speedway is now with Roger Penske in charge.
Well, he's already in the, he just got nailed with COVID. We ran an Indy 500 with no spectators. I was there in the giant parking lots behind the pagoda. They were empty. There were only the crews and the few of us from the media who were allowed to cover that thing. So he took a hit right off the top, but he's dedicated to that. He was the right person to buy the Speedway because he had the passion and he understood the history and he cared about it. But he's also a businessman, and so he just started improving things at the Speedway and improved them to this day. I mean, there's giant screens everywhere, and everything's a lot cleaner. One of the things that he did was he wanted to clean up the men's restrooms. And the men's restroom had really a stainless steel trough, maybe 15 feet long. So that was our urinal. And Roger was taking them all out. And a few of us went nuts. We said, come on, that's history. So he actually left one of them in one of the restrooms. And then he put out a T-shirt with a picture of it. You really got to stare at it to know, but there's a picture of one of the old urinals in there. He's done a lot of great work. He's 83 though, and we're wondering, we figure that his eldest son will end up taking it over, who runs the Penske Automotive Group right now, but we're going to lose him. Maybe not so long. Look at AJ, he's going to live forever. Giant, big guy. Somebody said earlier today, got the genes, he's still tromping around.
Age is just a number.
I have a question, maybe a little bit obscure. I remember as a kid always listening on the radio to the race, and there was a fella, I don't know if it's a young fella or an older fella, that would always tell about the history of the race and what historically had happened. Could you mention him?
He's actually a British guy who had written to Sid Collins. His name was Donald Davidson. And he had written to Sid in 1963 and told Sid that he had a perfect memory of everything in the 500. Well, he convinced Sid if he could fly to the U.S., Sid would bring him in the booth. And he's a savant. There's very few details of the 500 that you can't get him on. And so Sid hired him, and he's there ever since. He just retired last winter.
But you did mention, when we talked about Donald today, something Donald didn't know.
Yeah, that I would look up, because he and I were friends, and he'd come over the house and everything, and so I would try to find things that he didn't know, because there's always a little hole in that kind of memory. And he, by the way, had the same memory for heavyweight champions of the world. So I'd find things like for some reason, he always stumble on who finished 33rd in 1933. He blanks out on it. And his memory is pretty precise to the point that he couldn't tell you. You ask him, what was Eddie Sachs, what was the color of his car in 1960? Not a clue. So it was pretty narrow, but what an astonishing memory it was. I have trouble, and I've always had it, remembering the years, who won in what year. And in fact, broadcasting, when the race is over, it probably takes me about 2 weeks before I can tell you that I remember who won the race. I just, you do all that work and everything, you just kind of blank out on it for a while. But Donald's still around, and I don't know that he does any public work anymore, but he was an amazing guy. He was also in the National Guard with me. So, and he's now obviously a U.S. citizen. Super guy. I really appreciate it because I can have fun with the questions, as you see, and tell stories that otherwise, again, in this room. Yes, sir.
I always enjoyed before the start of the race, Jim Nabors singing Back Home Again in Indiana and the balloon release. Was that something that was a crowd favorite?
Oh, absolutely. And the story there is Phil Harris was going to sing it this particular year. And Phil Harris imbibed a great deal. And so he was barely able to stand up. And this is an hour before the race, and so the Speedway went casting about, and somebody said, what about this guy, Phil, Jim Nabors? And he said, well, I don't know how to sing any of that. And he's not really a singer, but they gave him a card with the words, and he got up and he sang, and it was incredible. It was unique and incredible. And when he passed, I tried to convince the Speedway, just use his recording from here on, make him immortal at the Speedway. I also tried the same thing. You can see how good of influence I have at the Speedway here. I also tried, we had Tom Carnegie, was maybe the best PA announcer I've ever heard, and he was known for phrases like, and he's on it. And it's a new track record. I mean, but he had a beautiful voice for doing it and everything. And I tried to convince them to take all of the samplings that they have of his voice and turn them into a MIDI file so that he could narrate. He could be the immortal PA guy. And I asked him once, we were just talking about the jobs and, what are the pitfalls and what do we do. And he told me that one of his techniques, when he didn't think he had anything, and he was a smart guy in that he was really able to space the PA commentary and let everything breathe nicely. And he said, sometimes the race gets dull and nothing's going on, and I want to get the crowd's attention back. He would say, "Where's Mario?" And the crowd would come to its feet. He said, I had no idea where Mario was. The phrase itself brought everybody to their feet.
What are your thoughts on Jimmy Johnson and if he'll eventually find success now running IndyCar as opposed to the NASCAR?
Well, I wish he would do better. I really wish. He's a super guy. Great champion, has a Ganassi car sponsored by Carvana, and Indy cars are different. It's like a bus to a fighter jet, and there's a lot of things that you really had to have done it for a long time to develop the ability to transition into it, and a lot of Cup guys have. Yarborough tried to do it, several of them, and it's a tough transition to make. Now, God bless him, he is trying his hardest. And he's got ovals down now. I think we're going to see a win on an oval. Road course, he still can't figure out. And of course, he really, with a Cup car, didn't have that much experience on a road course anyway. But he's a superhuman being. He speaks to everybody, and he knows that he's not driving well. He's humbled by it, and he will tell you he's humbled by it. This is a great challenge to him. So I love him. I think he's the best. Yeah, stick to the ovals. He at Iowa, which is a tiny little oval, a couple of weeks ago, he led that race, and it wasn't him, but the strategy that kind of lost it for him. But yeah, he's gonna land it on an oval, and the crowd's gonna go just crazy.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and the fondest memories I have are hearing the announcements of the Indy 500, and always look forward to it. You mentioned earlier that you had kind of gained the trust of some of the teams where you could kind of keep a secret. And what case would you cite where maybe you knew that a particular driver was either injured or ill, but you couldn't say anything? I mean, can you think of a particular case where, a driver really had to overcome something and you knew about it, but you really couldn't say anything during the race?
Well, I couldn't say anything during the race. And that was uncomfortable, but it's also a promise. And it's an unwritten promise I made with the community. And you're always going to be treated properly and with respect. And for the most part, that worked out, with the exception of working with Bobby Unser, Bobby Unser is the most unusual human being I've ever met. And we were close friends. He came and worked in the booth with us, and we had a great era where Bobby Unser was on this side and Sam Posey was on this side. Now, these are diametric opposites in terms of attitude and the preparation and everything. And every time Sam would make a point, and a salient a good point, then Bobby would immediately say, "Sam, you're dead wrong." And then he'd start talking, Bobby, and he'd work his way around. It may have taken him 30 seconds or so, but he'd work the argument around, and finally, he said exactly what Sam just said, just in a different way. And the important part was, Bobby Unser said it, therefore it is right.
But you had a little way of dealing with that.
Well, one year they tried to get me in a referee shirt because I was in between the two of them. With Sam, God bless him, he's got Parkinson's now, and one of the things that he can do with Parkinson's, he lives pretty close to Lime Rock, and one of the things he can do is drive a race car, which I guess is part of Parkinson's. I have a friend who can tango, but he's got Parkinson's, but the disease lets him tango. Same with Sam. He drives over when he gets a chance. He's quite an artist now, but he'd go over to Lime Rock and drive a small Formula car. Sam, when I came in with him, had this habit of 5x7 cards and maybe a stack that tall of ideas and thoughts that he wanted to do in the race. Well, of course, the problem with that is that you don't have time in a race. You have to keep your mind directly on the race. You don't have time to flip through cards and figure something out. As an aside to that, Roger Penske was my analyst in the first two Formula One races at Caesars Palace, and his assistants had a book like this tall, and he brought it up and I said, "Roger, might as well throw that away. You're not going to be able to use it." And he didn't believe it until the end of the race, and you're right. But Sam had these cards, and I kept saying, "Don't use those cards because they're slowing you down. Read them, write them. I write notes. I don't take them to the booth, but that's what jogs my memory." And he did it 3 years in a row, and finally he came into the booth and dropped his cards down after me every year saying, "Don't do that." So just as we're going on the air in the booth, I reach over and I pick up the cards and I throw them to the other side of the booth. I thought he was going to have a heart attack, but he was better. He was much better when I did it.
I was thinking of the switch.
I'm sorry?
I was thinking of the switch.
Oh, yeah, well, there's a Bobby Unser that we convinced Bobby at one time that I had a switch on my console and I could shut him off. And, I'd worked some stuff out with the audio guys, so it kind of worked. I had a cue where, during rehearsals and things. And Bobby went nuts with it. I got to talk, Paul. And this is his accent. My people want to hear me. Okay, Bobby. So I used this, and finally he realized that I was jerking him around. So he came back at me a year later at Indy, and we're on the booth, and we're getting ready to start a rehearsal, and he looks at me and says, "There's something wrong with your microphone." What? He said, "Talk. They can't hear you in the truck." So I talked. Now there's some, they want you to count to 4, you know. All right, testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. No, they can't hear you. And he, like he was listening to the truck, and they want you to count to 10. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I could at least get that far. Then he looked at me and he says, they want you to sing. You sucker. You brought me in totally. He and I became best friends, and I was invited to speak the eulogy at his funeral, which I made mostly with stories like I've just told you. Here's an example of a Bobby. Well, I always had to drive the rental car because he was banned from driving any rental car, because both he and his brother, because they weren't really good in it. And so we were driving along the Camelback Mountain in Scottsdale one year, and Bobby's looking out and he's looking up at the hill at all the fine and beautiful homes up there, and he's, boy, look at those, Paul, those are gorgeous. I said, yeah, they are. He says, let's go up there. Well, those are gated communities, Bobby. No, turn right here. And he was right. This road ran up the Camelback. So we go up, and we're running on the places we could, and he says, look at that house. Pull up there. In a little circular drive, I pulled up. I'm thinking, now they're calling the police. And Bobby jumps out of the car and runs up to the door, and knocks on the door, and the lady of the house answers the door. It's God's honest truth. He says, hi, I'm Bobby Unser, the fastest man alive and 3-time winner of the Indianapolis 500. Could I look at your house? I thought, we're definitely going to jail now. And the woman said, sure, come on in. That was Bobby. He could convince people of those kind of things. And we were both practical jokers. We both liked to snowmobile. In the winter, we used to have, we'd go up to Eagle River, Wisconsin, and Rick Mears would come along, Big Al Allenser Jr., me, and Bobby. But back at his home in New Mexico, in the winter, you'd go out there and he'd want a snowmobile. Except he would take you down onto a lake, not a frozen lake, it's wet. Now, snowmobiles do have flotation, but you got to stay on the throttle and stay balanced with it. And he loved it when somebody sunk one of his snowmobiles and had to swim to shore. One year we were in Eagle River, Wisconsin, and we were leading a group from Sea-Doo. Bobby was the host for this group, and we went out on one of the frozen lake beds, and it was cool up there because all of the inns and everything, the taverns, on what would have been the dock in the summer, would hang out signs and everything, and you'd pull up and go up to them. And so it was beautiful, beautiful time to be up there. So Bobby's leading us across the ice, and I'm second right behind him, and he's hauling, and he keeps kind of moving to the right on me. I'm trying to figure out what is he doing? I know he's up to something, but I don't know what it is. And then I noticed that there are mounds of snow going by here. I avoid them. I had no idea what they were, but when you're talking Bobby alongside you, you really be careful. And I got to the other side, we got off and waited for the group to catch up. And I said, Bobby, what are those little snow mounds? Oh, those are the blocks of ice that the fishermen pull out and put them there. If we'd hit one of those, we're doing like 80 miles an hour on the big sleds. We would have been a wreck. One time with Bobby, too, and I hope I'm not boring you with this, he was doing a photo shoot with Skidoo up in Canada, in Valcourt, Canada, and the whole family was part of this. So they're doing this photo shoot for publicity for the company, and Bobby and I get on 2 sleds, and we had a little racetrack we figured out through the woods there. And of course, Bobby's leading, and I'm trying desperately to catch him. And come around a blind corner, and Bobby has wrecked the sled. There are pieces of the sled everywhere. And it's like, Bobby, I don't know what we're going to do with that one. And he picks up most of the plastic and kind of sets it back on the sled in the way that works, and drove it back to where they were doing the shoot. And he thought he had it all figured out, except that when he hit the brakes, all those pieces fell off. It was like, there you go, Bobby, that's good. Nigel Mansell and I did that once too. We were at Barber, and the Porsche people had invited us to come drive their cars. And so we did, but they said 30 miles an hour, have fun, but don't go fast. Sure, be glad to do that. Of course, as soon as we're out of view, we're hammering at both of us. And at one point, I actually believed that I could pass the world driving champion. And I went down his inside on a right-hand corner, and I glanced over at him, and he's looking at me and laughing. And then I realized I totally overdrove the corner and just straight across and into the gravel pit. Got myself out. A little while later, Nigel did the same thing. So finally, we have to bring the cars in, and we do. And the same deal. We hit the brakes gently, and all the pebbles, the rocks fall out from under the car. And our penalty was we had to go speak to one of the driving classes they were having. And you imagine the faces of that class, totally unexpectedly, here's the world driving champion walking in a room. So, but all of those guys are just so much fun. Sometimes I've referred to it as a life of festive desperation. Because they live with the presence of serious injury or death. And so, one, it makes them very dedicated to their fans and their family and everything. And for example, most race drivers, I don't care what you're talking, Cup or IMSA or anything, if they see somebody in a wheelchair, they'll make a beeline to it. Because for some reason that rings in their hearts, and they want to go talk to that person. And so they're really good that way. And I think that's all part of the recognition that I might not be able to do this tomorrow. So it makes them, well, they're different to begin with. They can do things that none of us can really imagine. But they're all of them. They're just great human beings to be around, special.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Yep. Just curious, do you have a Robin Miller story that you can tell us that's safe?
How much time do you have?
For those of you that don't know Robin, he passed away last year. He was the best rider on motorsports ever. Excuse me. And he and I were good friends. And I'm sorry. Robin wanted to get a Formula Ford. I had one, and that's what I was racing. So Robin worked out this deal with Andy Granatelli. They had a McNamara Formula Ford in STP colors, and Andy gave it to him. But Robin needed a trailer to go get it, so he used my trailer. So now we come down to Indianapolis Raceway Park, the oval there, and Robin's going to test drive this thing for the first time. And Art Pollard, one of the great racers, he had broken his leg that year, so he was on crutches. And he came over to help Robin, and we were all there to help Robin. And this man with incredible knowledge of racing goes out on the oval, and he can't find third gear. Well, the little Hewlin gearboxes we had then were pretty tight, so he'd come in and we're like, here's third, here's fourth, okay. Back out, and he'd go around, and one lap, he's, I got two gears, next lap, I got three, never got to fourth. But he brings the car in, and because he's having some oil pressure issues. And, okay, so we can deal with that. And we pulled the cowling off, and there was a piece of tape across the oil tank said, no oil. So he just totally destroyed that motor. But he started a lunch at a place in Speedway on Main Street called Charlie Brown's, and a Friday lunch for the racers. And it's kind of a moving festival. Whoever's in town comes through, and all of the drivers come there. Penske came there. He single all his life, good-hearted man, and a brilliant rider, but a really good friend too.
Okay. Well,
you're not going to shut it off, are you? We're having fun here.
Yeah. No. I want to give people time to come down, maybe get pictures and that kind of stuff. So So if you guys don't mind, we'll try and
Sure,
end it here.
that'd be fun.
So that you guys have time to come down and get your picture if you want, or maybe ask.
Before anybody moves, I just want to thank Paul.
Yes.
Thank
so
you.
Please.
Thank you very much.
Paul Page, everybody.
Thank you. I hope you had fun.
So thanks everybody for coming, and please feel free to come on down, get your picture.